Millionaire CEO yells, "You don't belong here." The quiet janitor answers, "I'm here for my daughter," and everything changed. "You don't belong here." The sharp voice cut through the quiet elegance of the executive lounge. Outside, snow drifted lazily past the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering skyline of New York glowing in the fading light. Eleanor Vance stood in the doorway, her cream-colored coat hugging her frame, blonde hair catching the warm gold of the sunset. At 32, she carried herself with the practiced poise of a woman who had built an empire and guarded it fiercely. Moments ago, she had walked out of a high-stakes boardroom meeting, a multi-million-dollar deal sealed in her favor. Now her sharp blue eyes were fixed on the stranger in her private space. A man in a dark navy janitor's uniform had stepped into the VIP lounge as if he belonged there. His movements were brisk, almost urgent, and his gaze searched the room like a man on a mission. Eleanor's rules for this floor were absolute. Service staff were not permitted when executives or special guests were present. She closed the distance between them, her heels striking the marble floor like a metronome. The man stopped and turned toward her, meeting her stare without flinching. His eyes were deep, steady, and carried something that was neither defiance nor apology, only resolve. "I'm here for my daughter," he said, his voice low and measured, yet unyielding. A tense silence hung between them, the kind that makes the air feel heavier. Eleanor, still holding her ground, felt the instinct to pull out her phone and summon security, but before she could, she noticed the way his attention shifted, his gaze moving past her toward the far corner of the lounge. She followed it. There, in a leather armchair, far too big for her, sat a little girl no older than 3, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around a worn brown teddy bear, its fur matted from love and years of handling. She stared out the window, her wide, dark eyes tracking the lazy fall of the snow. A puffy pink coat wrapped her small body, and a thick knit scarf, almost comically large, was wound around her neck. The man, Daniel, moved past Eleanor, each step deliberate but gentle, as if not to startle the child. He crouched down so his face was level with hers, the weight of his body dropping easily to the polished floor. One large, work-worn hand reached up to adjust the scarf that had slipped sideways, tucking it neatly beneath her chin. His palm lingered for a moment on her cheek, checking for cold. "Daddy's here now," he murmured, the roughness in his voice softened into something warmer, something meant only for her. The little girl, Lily, looked up at him, her lips curling into a tiny, relieved smile. She reached out with a mittened hand and touched his jaw, as if to reassure him in return. The gesture was so natural, so intimate, that Eleanor felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. It was not irritation, it was not pity. It was something else entirely. Daniel glanced up at her then, the look in his eyes protective yet calm. "One of the staff from the art program downstairs brought her up here," he explained. "She thought this would be a warm and safe place for her to wait until I could get here." His words were simple, without excuses or embellishment. Eleanor did not reply. She simply shifted her gaze to her watch, noting the time, and turned toward the exit. Her steps were slower than before, the hard rhythm of her heels muted against the floor. As the elevator doors began to close, she caught one last glimpse through the narrowing gap. Daniel stooping to pick up Lily's teddy bear from the floor, brushing a few tiny snowflakes from its fur, before placing it gently back into her arms. Eleanor closed her office door behind her, the faint click echoing in the high-ceilinged space. The view from the 45th floor stretched far across Manhattan, but she hardly saw it. The image of the janitor, of Daniel, kneeling beside his daughter, adjusting her scarf, still lingered stubbornly in her mind. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to focus on the stack of documents on her desk. But the stillness of the room, the dim winter light spilling through the glass, began to pull her backward in time. The scent of cold air and wet pavement seemed to rise from nowhere, and suddenly she was 12 years old again, standing outside the corner store with her father. His breath reeked of whiskey, his jacket stained from work at the docks. She remembered the way the shopkeeper's eyes slid past her to the other customers, the faint wrinkle of disgust at the corner of his mouth. She had stood there holding her father's change, wishing she could disappear into the cracks in the sidewalk. Those years had taught her to keep her chin high, her expression cold, and her emotions locked away where no one could use them against her. Somewhere below, in the building's depths, Daniel Cruz worked quietly in the service level. The maintenance corridors smelled faintly of cleaning solution and warm metal from the boilers. He pushed his cart steadily, stopping to replace a flickering light in a supply room. 2 young security guards passed by, their laughter sharp and careless. "Hey, Cruz, how's the architect thing going?" one called out, his tone mocking. The other chuckled, adding, "Guess designing bathrooms for billionaires didn't pan out, huh?" Daniel said nothing. His hand stayed busy, screwing the new bulb into place. Silence was his armor. A few minutes later, as he crossed the lobby's service hall, something on the floor caught his eye. A delicate silver necklace, its pendant a small, heart-shaped locket. He bent down, picked it up carefully, and rubbed away the faint smudge of dirt with the edge of his sleeve. Then, instead of slipping it into his pocket, he walked it over to the front desk. "Someone might come looking for this," he told the receptionist, setting it gently on the counter. Upstairs, in her office, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the wall-mounted security feed. A small screen showed the lobby from above, and there he was, Daniel, leaving the necklace on the desk before disappearing back into the service elevator. Something about the simple act, the absence of hesitation, caught her attention. She leaned back in her chair, frowning slightly, though she could not have said why. Across town, later that evening, in a small apartment with peeling paint and the faint hum of a radiator, Lily sat at a worn wooden table, crayons scattered around her. She was bent over a piece of paper, tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. The picture took shape in bright colors, a field, a winding path, and in the distance, a row of hills beneath a warm orange sky. She drew not from sight, but from memory. Her tiny heart, fragile from birth, made running and climbing impossible, so she painted the landscapes she had only ever visited in her mind. Daniel watched her from the kitchen, a dish towel over his shoulder. There was pride in his eyes, but also a shadow of worry he could not quite hide. When Lily looked up and held out her drawing for him to see, he smiled, genuine and soft, as though the weight of the day had eased for just a moment. The storage archive on the 20th floor was colder than the rest of the building, its air tinged with the faint scent of dust and paper. Rows of tall metal shelving units stretched down narrow aisles, each crammed with labeled binders, rolled blueprints, and sealed folders from decades of projects. Eleanor walked in with a purpose, her heels clicking on the polished concrete. She was looking for a set of original contracts tied to a recent acquisition, documents she preferred to review herself rather than trust to assistants. Her gloved fingers trailed briefly along the spines of the binders as she scanned the labels. From somewhere deeper in the archives came the low hum of voices, carrying just enough for her to distinguish the words. She turned a corner, stepping into the next aisle, and froze. Daniel stood a few feet away, his cart parked at the end of the row. Opposite him was an older man in coveralls, the kind of veteran employee who had been in the building longer than most executives. The old man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Still feels strange, doesn't it? You walking past this place every day." Daniel gave a faint, almost rueful smile. "Strange isn't the word. I spent 2 years of my life on these drawings." He gestured toward a rolled-up blueprint on a nearby shelf. Every line of the Vance Tower design was mine. Angles, materials, even the atrium layout. And then, he let the sentence trail off, his eyes momentarily distant. The older man sighed, his voice carrying a note of bitterness. "And then they wiped your name off the plans and handed the credit to the boss upstairs. Happens more than people think." Eleanor's stomach tightened. The boss upstairs. Her father. She stayed hidden between the shelves, listening, her pulse quickening. Daniel's voice was calm, without any trace of anger, but the words hit like a quiet hammer. I learned something that day. Sometimes it's not enough to be the best at what you do. If you do not own the game, you're just another piece to be moved. Or removed. She felt a flicker of disbelief, quickly followed by resistance. This could just be the story of a bitter man rewriting his past. It happened all the time in corporate circles, people convincing themselves they had been robbed, when in truth they simply had not been good enough. And yet, something in the way he said it made her pause longer than she intended. A sudden sound broke her thoughts, the clatter of a paper cup hitting the floor. Around the corner, a young administrative assistant stood frozen, coffee dripping down the front of her blouse. Her cheeks burned red as she fumbled with the damp fabric. Without hesitation, Daniel stepped toward her. "Here," he said gently, shrugging off a clean, dark gray jacket from the top of his cart. "Put this on before it stains." The young woman stammered a thank you, slipping into the jacket while he bent down to gather the scattered papers she had dropped. His movements were unhurried, patient, as if the moment belonged entirely to helping her. Once she was steady again, he gave her a reassuring nod and returned to his cart, resuming his work as if nothing had happened. Eleanor found herself watching him for a few seconds longer before forcing her gaze back to the binders in front of her. She pulled the one she had come for, the weight of it solid in her hands, but her mind felt heavier still. She told herself it was ridiculous to dwell on the conversation she had overheard. She told herself that men like Daniel often embellish their pasts. But as she left the archives, the image of him, quietly handing over his own jacket to protect a stranger, followed her out into the brighter, warmer hall. The basement level of Vance Tower was quiet that night, the air humming with the low, steady vibration of machinery. It was past 9, long after most of the staff had gone home, but a minor electrical outage had been flagged in the system alerts. Eleanor had decided to check it herself, rather than leave it to the morning team. She liked to keep the building's operations under her own scrutiny, especially when investors were coming in the next day. The service corridor smelled faintly of warm metal and cleaning fluid. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, industrial glow. As she turned a corner, she caught sight of Daniel. He was bent over the open panel of a breaker box, his uniform damp with sweat across the back. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing forearms taut from effort. A faint streak of dust marked his cheek. His phone, set on a nearby ledge, vibrated against the metal surface. The screen lit up with an incoming call. Dr. H. Mendel, Children's Cardiology. He hesitated for a second, then wiped his hands on a rag and answered. "Yes, this is Daniel," he said, his voice quieter now, edged with fatigue. Eleanor stepped closer to the wall, the sound of the machinery covering her presence. On the other end, the voice was faint but clear enough for her to catch pieces. The doctor was explaining that the cost estimate for the surgery had increased. Complications in Lily's condition meant they would need specialized equipment and a longer recovery period. Daniel's brow tightened, his free hand bracing against the breaker panel. I understand," he said, his voice low. "I'll get the money. Just don't delay the date if you can help it." There was a pause, and then more softly, "She's only 3. She's been through enough." Eleanor's gaze followed him as he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he took a worn photograph, creased at the edges, colors fading from years of handling. It showed Lily in a tiny yellow dress, her curls wild, her smile wide and unguarded. Daniel stared at the picture for a long moment, the hardness she was used to seeing in him melting into something vulnerable, almost fragile. His thumb brushed lightly over the image, as though touching her face could bridge the distance. For the first time since she had met him, Eleanor felt the edge of her own certainty waver. This was not the quiet, self-contained janitor she had mentally filed away. This was a father carrying a weight she could almost feel pressing against her own chest. She stepped back into the shadows, unwilling to let him see her there. The low murmur of his voice to the doctor faded as she turned and walked away, the click of her heels muffled by the hum of the building. Back in her office, she found herself staring out at the city lights, but all she could see was the basement, Daniel's hand gripping that worn photograph, the way his shoulders seemed to bear more than one man's share of burden. She told herself it was none of her concern, and yet the image stayed with her, lingering like the aftertaste of something she could not quite name. The alarm blared without warning, a harsh, pulsing sound that cut through the hum of the evening. Eleanor looked up from her desk, the faint vibration underfoot telling her this was not a drill. A flashing red banner scrolled across her office security panel, electrical fire, basement level. She grabbed her coat and headed for the elevator. A part of her knew she should wait for the fire team, but this was her building, her responsibility. She wanted to see the situation firsthand. The elevator shuddered as it descended, the faint scent of smoke already creeping into the shaft. At floor B1 there was a sudden jolt, a loud metallic groan, and the car lurched to a stop. The lights flickered, then dimmed to the emergency glow of the red panel. Eleanor pressed the intercom button, but all she got was static. Smoke began to seep in through the tiny gap at the top of the doors, curling downward in lazy, sinister tendrils. She pulled her scarf over her nose, but the acrid sting hit her throat anyway. The air was getting heavier. Down the hall outside, Daniel was running. He had been in the maintenance bay when the breaker box erupted in sparks, flames catching on the nearby insulation. He had grabbed the nearest fire extinguisher, knocking down the smaller flames, but the main blaze had spread into the wiring conduits, feeding on the plastic and dust. The overhead sprinklers had not yet kicked in. Something in the system had failed. Through the haze, he saw the elevator's floor indicator frozen on B1. His stomach clenched. He knew exactly who had taken it down here. Only one executive ever came to the basement unannounced. Without thinking, he grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the wall and ran toward the doors. Inside the elevator, Eleanor coughed, her eyes watering as she banged on the metal. The sound of hurried footsteps approached, followed by a muffled voice. "Eleanor, step back from the doors." It was Daniel. The pounding began immediately, loud, metallic, urgent. She retreated to the far corner just as the pry bar wedged into the seam between the doors. With a grunt, Daniel forced the metal apart, the gap widening inch by inch until his soot-streaked face appeared through the smoke. "Come on," he shouted, reaching for her. She took his hand, the grip solid and warm despite the cold bite of the bar still in his other hand. He pulled her through the narrow opening into the smoky corridor. The heat was stronger out here, the fire at the far end of the hall licking at the ceiling. Daniel dropped the bar, pulled the oxygen mask from the emergency kit on his belt, and pressed it over her face before she could protest. "Breathe," he ordered, voice hoarse from the smoke. His own breathing was ragged, and he coughed hard, his chest shaking with the effort. They moved low and fast toward the service stairwell, Daniel keeping himself between her and the thickest smoke. The mask's clean air was a blessing, but each time she glanced at him, she saw the strain in his eyes, the gray tinge of ash clinging to his hair. At the stairwell, the cool rush of fresher air met them. He guided her up the steps until they reached the ground-level exit, where the night air hit like a wave. Eleanor pulled the mask from her face, gasping in the cold. Daniel leaned against the wall for a moment, catching his breath before the building's sprinkler system finally roared to life and the muffled hiss of steam replaced the sound of open flames. Fire crews poured into the lobby, taking over the scene. Eleanor stood there, still breathing hard, watching as Daniel waved off medical attention with a brief shake of his head. His hands were blackened from soot, his shirt damp with sweat and smoke, but he gave her a short nod as if to say, "It's handled." For the first time she saw him without the filter of his uniform or the boundaries of their roles. This was a man who had run toward danger, not away from it. a man who had thought to give her air before himself. She felt something shift inside her, a crack in the armor she had built long ago. But she straightened her coat, smoothing her hair, and turned away before he could see it. Whatever she felt, she told herself, did not belong in the open. Not yet. The late afternoon light slanted across Eleanor's desk, painting long shadows over the stack of files she had pulled from the archive room. She had been reviewing historical documents for the tower's upcoming anniversary gala. Old contracts, press clippings, architectural records. Most of it was familiar, a history she had grown up hearing at her father's side. One large, rolled blueprint sat at the bottom of the pile, its edges frayed from years in storage. She unrolled it carefully, the crisp crackle of aged paper filling the quiet office. It was the original design of Vance Tower, her father's greatest triumph, the project that had propelled the family name to the top of New York's real estate world. Her eyes moved across the intricate lines, the precise measurements, the elegant detailing of the atrium and the upper floors. And then she saw it. In the lower right corner, faint under the stamp of the company logo, a name partially smudged but still legible. Daniel Cruz. She stared at the signature, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. For a moment she thought she might be mistaken, but the handwriting was clear enough beneath the faded ink. She traced it with her fingertip, remembering the conversation she had overheard in the archives. The quiet conviction in Daniel's voice when he had spoken of drawing these very lines. Memory pulled her back years, to the day the tower opened. She had been in her early 20s, standing beside her father in the grand atrium as photographers crowded around them. He had smiled for the cameras, telling the story of his vision, the design process, the inspiration that had led to this glass and steel monument. She had never questioned it. Why would she? The applause had been deafening, the praise endless. Her father had always told her that winning in business meant taking opportunities and never looking back. But now the truth stared up at her from the paper, a truth smudged but not erased. Daniel had been the architect. His name should have been etched in bronze in the lobby, not hidden under a corporate stamp. She sat back in her chair, the weight of the blueprint pressing down on her as if the paper itself carried the burden of what had been done. A hot wave of anger rose in her chest, not just at the theft, but at the fact that she had been blind to it for so long. And yet, beneath the anger was something else. Resistance. This was her father, the man who had raised her, who had built the company she now ran. He was gone now, his legacy resting in her hands. To admit the truth would mean tarnishing that legacy, undoing the story the world believed. Her mind shifted between images. Her father's proud smile, Daniel's quiet dignity, Lily's small hand reaching up to her father's face. She thought of the night in the basement when she had seen him looking at that worn photograph as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The conflict twisted in her chest, sharp and relentless. Loyalty to family had been the foundation of her life. But the foundation of the building she stood in, the one that bore her family's name, belonged to someone else. Eleanor rolled the blueprint back up with deliberate care, but the smudged signature burned in her mind. She knew this truth could not be unseen, no matter how much she wished to return to the comfort of ignorance. And she knew, deep down, that the decision she would have to make was not one she could avoid forever. The day began in its usual rhythm until the sharp sound of raised voices cut through the air. Eleanor was in a meeting with 2 board members when her assistant slipped in, pale and tense. "You should see this," she whispered. In the lobby, a small crowd had gathered. Daniel stood between 2 security guards, wrists gripped tightly, his face unreadable. One guard projected his accusation for all to hear. Caught him trying to take a thermal imaging scanner out the service entrance, worth more than his annual salary. Murmurs spread through the bystanders. Eleanor's heels struck the marble as she approached. "What is going on here?" she demanded. The head of security lowered his voice. "Ms. Vance, We believe Mr. Cruz was stealing from company property. It's all in the report." Daniel didn't defend himself, only met her gaze with quiet, steady eyes now shadowed by exhaustion. Behind her, the board members whispered, "Bad for the company's image. Deal with it quickly." Pressure to protect the brand was immediate, but Eleanor felt a knot in her stomach. She remembered Daniel pulling her through fire, the smudged signature on the blueprint. "I'll review the footage myself before making any decisions," she said, tone firm enough to silence further protest. Daniel was escorted to a holding room while she made her way to the security control center. Hours later, after combing through angles of the service corridors, she found it. Another maintenance worker, already on record for misconduct, slipping the scanner into Daniel's cart while his back was turned. Minutes later, a tip was called in, conveniently pointing security toward him. It was a setup. She sat back, the blue glow of the monitor lighting her face. She could clear his name with this. She would. But before she could move, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her chest tighten. Dr. Mendel. His voice was urgent. Lily had suffered a sudden episode. Her heart rate had dropped dangerously low, and she was being prepped for emergency surgery. "We need immediate consent and confirmation for financial coverage." Within minutes, Eleanor was in her private office, pulling up her personal accounts. The cost was staggering, even for her, but she didn't hesitate. She called the hospital's billing department, authorizing full payment under the condition her name remained off the record. By the time she reached the hospital, Daniel was in the waiting room, hunched forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. She stayed in the hallway, speaking quietly with the nurse to ensure nothing delayed the surgery. The hours dragged. Eleanor sat in a quiet corner with a cooling cup of coffee, pretending to read her phone but unable to focus. She told herself she was only there to make sure the payment went through, but deep down she knew she couldn't leave. When the surgeon finally emerged, his expression was calm. "She's stable," he told Daniel. Relief broke across his features, and for the first time since she had met him, his eyes shone with unshed tears. Later, Lily lay sleeping in her recovery bed, her small hand resting on a blanket, the worn teddy bear tucked under her arm. Daniel had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, exhaustion softening the lines of his face. Eleanor slipped quietly into the room and knelt by the bed. She hesitated, then gently took the child's hand. Lily stirred, blinking up at her. "You're the lady from Daddy's work," she whispered, voice still raspy from the anesthesia. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Yes, I just wanted to make sure you're okay." The little girl's lips curved in the faintest smile. "The blonde lady. She held my hand when Daddy was sleeping." Her voice trailed off as her eyes closed again. Eleanor released her hand slowly, letting her gaze rest on Daniel for a fleeting moment, before slipping silently from the room, leaving behind only the soft trace of her perfume and the quiet warmth of her touch. The grand lobby of Vance Tower glowed with the warm magic of Christmas Eve. Garlands of evergreen draped along the marble balustrades, their dark green softened by the golden light of hundreds of tiny bulbs. A towering fir tree, glittering with silver ornaments and a star that seemed to catch every glint from the chandeliers above, stood at the center of the room. The air carried the faint scent of cinnamon and pine, mingling with the murmur of voices and the occasional chime of laughter. Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd, her cream silk gown catching the light with each movement. She had spent weeks planning this night, not just as the company's annual Christmas gala, but as something far more personal. In the front row of the gathered guests, Daniel sat with Lily on his lap, the little girl in a soft white dress and a red ribbon in her curls. Her eyes were wide with wonder at the glittering decoration. When the music faded, Eleanor stepped forward to the microphone. Conversation stilled, and the only sound was the faint crackle of the massive fireplace. "Tonight," she began, her voice steady but warm, "is about more than celebrating the season. It's about honoring the people who built this place, not just in brick and steel, but in vision and heart. She let her gaze find Daniel's, holding it for a moment before turning back to the audience. Many years ago, the design for this tower was the work of a man whose name was never given the credit it deserved. That man is Daniel Cruz. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, whispers carrying the name from one side of the room to the other. It was his creativity, his dedication, and his skill that gave us this building we are all proud to call our own. Tonight, I am correcting an injustice done long before my time. She signaled to an assistant, who brought forward a framed bronze plaque engraved with Daniel's full name beneath the title Architect of Vance Tower. "This will hang in our lobby for as long as these walls stand," Eleanor said. Then she reached into the envelope she had been holding and removed a folded document. "And as a personal act of restitution, I am granting Daniel Cruz partial ownership of Vance Tower. From this night forward, this building belongs to both of us." Applause rose, first tentative, then swelling into a warm, sustained ovation. Daniel's expression was one of shock, then slow comprehension. He rose to his feet, Lily's small hand clutching his, and stepped forward. When the applause faded, Eleanor moved toward him. The crowd seemed to fade away until it was just the two of them beneath the golden light. "Daniel," she said quietly, though the microphone carried her words to every corner of the room. "This building brought us together, but it's not the only thing I want to share with you." There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly softened by something deeper. "I've learned that strength isn't just about standing alone," she continued. "It's about knowing when to stand with someone else. And I want to stand with you." For a moment, the sounds of clinking glasses and rustling garments seemed to vanish. Daniel's hand found hers, warm and steady. His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles as he leaned just close enough for only her to hear. "We both belong here now." The words, simple and sure, sent a quiet warmth through her chest. Around them, the clock struck midnight. Bells from a nearby church rang out, their chimes mingling with the cheer of the guests. Later, when the music swelled again and the party resumed, Eleanor, Daniel, and Lily slipped away to the mezzanine balcony. Through the tall glass windows, the city stretched before them, rooftops and streets softened under a fresh layer of snow. Lily pressed her small palms to the glass, her breath fogging a tiny circle as she whispered, "It's beautiful." Eleanor glanced at Daniel, their shoulders brushing as they stood side by side. Beyond the glass, the snow kept falling, each flake catching the light before disappearing into the quiet streets below. In that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the steady warmth of something new, something they would build together. And so, on that snowy Christmas night, a stolen past was set right, a fractured trust was mended, and 3 lives found a place they could finally call home. Eleanor and Daniel stood not as a CEO and a janitor, but as 2 people bound by respect, truth, and a love that had grown quietly between the cracks of adversity. With Lily's laughter echoing softly in the grand hall, the tower that had once been a symbol of ambition became, at last,